Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined for a second time by Dr. John Barry. Today is part two of our conversation about his and Louise Liddon's book, Perspectives in Male Psychology, an introduction. So, Dr. Barry, welcome to the show again. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. Thanks indeed for inviting me back.
So today we're going to run through a few topics like education, occupation, the military, and stuff like that. So starting with education, is it that nowadays, at least in the more developed societies, boys are struggling in the education system? And if so, in what ways?
Yeah, it's a really important topic. I mean, in the UK, since the late 1980s, boys have started falling behind girls in terms of their educational achievement. So the grades have been lower than girls. And I mean, there's a few things about this. One is it's really interesting that so little is said about this. I mean, I think when girls were behind boys in education on some subjects in years previously, it was quite a big issue and people thought it was an urgent thing that should be overcome. But for boys to be behind in education, I don't think is really on a lot of people's radar. And that's even true of the educational people in the UK who you think would be most in tune with what's happening and see most need. I think, unfortunately, a lot of the times boys are blamed for their own academic failure. You often get the impression that boys are seen as a bit too noisy, a bit too energetic, and a bit too disinclined to read the books that they're given. But against that, you'll have a lot of people saying, well, you know, boys are more energetic than girls. I mean, they will tend to want to run around a bit more, and that they have, well, surprise, surprise, I mean, that there are differences between boys and girls, but often people don't like to look at the fact that there are differences, that sex differences exist, and that a lot of people are very uncomfortable about the idea of acknowledging sex differences, even though it can be very beneficial to men and women, boys and girls, to be made aware that there are these differences, because you can then accommodate things like teaching style to help overcome any problems that might arise by trying a one-size-fits-all, for example, to education. For example, there's I was speaking to somebody, I was interviewing Erin Pizzey, who's well known in the domestic violence field, and she had done about a year or so of helping children who are falling behind in their reading ability, and these were pretty much all boys, and one of the things that she commented on was that the boys just didn't like a lot of the reading material that they were getting. It was a bit more orientated towards the kinds of interests that girls might have, that, in her opinion, and she found that they liked more kind of I think it was my brother's Exploding Bottom or something like that was the name of one of the books that she recommended. The boys seemed to like to read. They thought it was fun. It was a bit kind of lewd, but it got boys to start reading, and I think that's a really important thing. I mean, and it's a bit of a recurring theme when it comes to a lot of issues that face men. When men are having problems, often they get blamed for having those problems. Like, so even if it's boys falling behind in reading or education, it's like it's their own fault. Why can't they be like the girls? Whereas, you know, it's why can't we just, you know, help people to enjoy and engage in their education in a way that suits them, rather than trying to have a one-size-fits-all approach. And it could be something to do with the fact that there is the vast majority, I think it's about 90% of primary school teachers are female. And I think in that sense, I mean, it doesn't mean that they're not good teachers at all, but it just might mean that they're not quite as in tune with the needs of the boys. Whereas if you have a male teacher, you could imagine that perhaps they could think back to when they were a boy and how they were in school, or how their schoolmates were, and sort of try and accommodate that type of behavior a bit more. So I think we have a long way to go in terms of address, even starting to recognize these as being serious issues. Although in the UK we have started to have some progress in that way. We have I don't want to go off on a different topic too much, but in the last year we've had what's called an APPG for men and boys, and this is an all-party parliamentary group, which is a body that is created in part by government ministers in Parliament, in the Lords and the Commons, and they kind of get a group of experts to try and kind of invite various people along who are experts on various topics to help them to understand how laws and legislation might be driven. And one of the things that they've done recently is have this one for men and boys, and the first report that they did was called A Boy Today, and it was about the kinds of issues that boys are facing today, including the problem of falling behind in education. And I think it's a rare bit of light at the end of a tunnel, I think, for a lot of people that we have now got at least some ministers, some people in government who are starting to recognize this. It's a start, at least.
So, and I mean, this falling behind of boys in terms of education and educational attainment also translates into job and career prospects, right? And I mean, later we might talk about sex differences in occupations in terms of preferences, but that's another slightly different topic. But that also has implications on that kind of issue, right?
Absolutely. I mean, so boys, obviously, if they fall behind in education, they're not going to achieve university degrees to the same degree that women are. And of course, there's more women going to university now than men are, and another issue that tends to get overlooked. And this, I mean, in some ways, I don't think all boys need to have a university education, or not everybody needs to have a university education or very much education. I think it depends on what kind of person you are and what your kind of things you want to do with your life. I don't see any problem whatsoever with people going into things like apprenticeships, as we have in the UK, where you kind of at about age 14 you go into a kind of more practical vocational type of education where you might learn a trade like being a mechanic or a plumber or an electrician, which are extremely useful things for any society to have, and actually they're quite well paid, these professions too. So I don't see any problem with boys going into that sort of thing, but it seems that boys are not. It's not that they're opting out of university to go into some other career. It looks like they're kind of being nudged along a kind of an academic path, but then falling out and not really doing anything then very much. And in fact, one of the problems that we have in this field, as in lots of areas to do with male psychology, a lot of what we know about male psychology is a bit patchy because people tend to overlook problems that are happening to men or boys. And one of the areas that we don't know all that much about is what happens to the boys who drop out of education. There's not really any way of following them up systematically. I mean, I'm sure the government collects lots of data that would be useful in helping to expose what happens to these boys. But one might wonder about, people who just drift aimlessly for all the time, or even worse, drift into, gangs or, other ways of life that just lead them nowhere. And this is a tragedy, and it's not just a tragedy for the boys or their families. It's a tragedy for everybody, because these lives are not only unfulfilled and not maybe generating as much kind of benefits for society as they could do, but of course they might generate a net loss for society if boys become delinquent or kind of become a burden on the state and these sorts of things.
So just putting aside for a second perhaps what politicians, people in the education system, professors even, or teachers could do about these sort of issues, do you think that the way we teach sex and gender to children in school should be changed and not so much follow these sort of recent guidelines that are more, I mean, how should I put it? I usually don't like to use this word, but that are perhaps a little bit more woke, let's say.
Yeah. Uh, I see. Now, this is an area that I don't know very much about, and in fact, the whole thing of what boys are taught in school is something of a grey area for me. You could probably, I mean, I think it's an important area, but for me, I don't know very much about it. Um, I can't say that pre the last few years of gender being taught in kind of, as you say, woke sort of ways. There have been these workshops that have been going on in schools around the world, but in the UK we've had workshops that try and encourage boys to behave in a kind of a better way, like be more pro-social. But basically, I mean, it's good if people learn to be pro-social. I mean, that's definitely a good thing. But they're being taught that masculinity is a potentially dangerous thing and something that their masculinity might cause them to do bad things, like be violent to each other, be violent to women, or be sexually aggressive towards women, and this kind of thing. And I would like to know more about this, and it's something that I've tried a few times to find out more about. It's a little bit difficult to find out about these things, but these workshops are affecting our children, so I think it's quite important that they are more open and more transparent about what happens. But yeah, it's a slightly different answer to your question. But I agree. I mean, like these sorts of developments are, I think, a bit concerning. I mean, gender is an important issue, but I'm not sure that school is the best place to be spending a lot of time learning about it. And if you are learning about gender, I would think that learning about it in a scientific way might be more beneficial than learning about it in other sorts of ways. It's school after all.
So another topic, and I think this also applies in the context of school because we also have things like physical education. What is the importance of sports for men's and boys' development and their mental well-being?
Yeah, well, sports is one of these areas that's quite important to men, and I certainly in the time that I've been growing up, the last few decades, it's been kind of looked down upon that men are so interested in football or basketball, and that it's seen as something that's silly and trivial, and that men really should be doing more useful things with their time. And people, playing football, it's just like, people, kicking around a bag of air or throwing around a bag of air, which is kind of very negative views of sport. Whereas for a lot of men, it's enjoyable, and then something that's enjoyable and meaningful in your life is not a trivial thing. I mean, it's about enhancing your well-being, enhancing your mental health, and I think that when we as a society denigrate these things, I don't think that we realize quite how much that we're also depriving men of natural ways of helping them feel okay. And so, like, it's an underappreciated point that men tend to like team sports more than women do, and they like watching these team sports. They like playing them. They like being competitive, and again, being competitive is another thing. If you go back to schools, it's being discouraged in the last few years. Like, being competitive is seen as something that's negative, and I think you can take anything to an extreme and it will be a negative thing. Anything, but it's not extreme just to want to, say, play football in school amongst friends or in teams or compete with each other and kind of earn trophies. I mean, I think framing those things as being a negative, I think is in a way it's ridiculous, and it's certainly depriving lots of people of the enjoyment of playing sports and the enjoyment of watching sports too.
So let me know if you feel uneasy about this question, but this is also one that recently have been popping up in the news and in discussions that unfortunately many times are politically polarizing. But do you think that, taking into account what we know about male and female development, that there should be sex segregation in sports?
I think for some sports, it's men and women competing together is fine. But I mean, these would be sports that are maybe on the less physical end of things. So, for example, archery. Lots of women compete to a very high level in archery. But things like boxing or mixed martial arts, I think we have to say that men have a natural advantage in terms of muscle mass, muscle power, bone strength, height, weight. I mean, all the things that will make somebody better at these sort of combat orientated sports. Men, again, sort of not all men, but like at the extreme end of the scale, like men are going to be bigger, stronger, faster than the average woman. And I think this is when you have Hollywood showing women beating up big men and things like that. I think it's an underappreciated issue, but in fact, I mean, there was some research I saw recently, and we cite in the book, that shows that if you had, like in various sports, I think the example we gave was the 800 meters. If you had men and women compete against each other, you wouldn't have any women in the top 100 or 200 of the competitors. I mean, they would be beaten by a lot of boys too. I mean, the top female competitors, which is not saying anything bad about women. It's just a biological fact that, and it's not something that really can be overcome by taking steroids either, because a lot of these sex differences, these physiological sex differences, are prenatally programmed. So we if you're a boy, you'll have a Y chromosome, which will trigger a release of testosterone from the fetal gonads at around 13 weeks of gestational age. And this release of testosterone, which is called the testosterone surge, it will give you levels of testosterone that are roughly equivalent to those that a teenage boy will experience as a spurt into puberty and adolescence. And so these are very high levels of testosterone that the male fetus, not the female fetus, will experience prenatally. And this programs for the later development of all the things that we see as physiologically masculine. So the kind of greater muscle mass, muscle power, the shape of the face, bone density, all of these things are prenatally programmed. So you can't really catch up from that sort of level of prenatal programming. And so for sports where power and strength are the main reasons that people win, men do have a natural advantage over women. And I don't think that, if women want to compete with men, I think that's up to them, really. But there is a reason for sex segregation in some sports, and it does make sense. And I think that, if women want to kind of compete and kind of strive to be the best that they can be in a particular type of sport, I think it's only fair that they're not trying to compete with people who have just what would almost seem like an unfair advantage, but it's like a natural advantage. It's a complex question, and it's in some ways it's a question about people's choices about what they do with their lives. But I think we all, at the end of the day, have to decide on the basis of what's fair for people. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where that is. It's always going to be complicated, though, isn't it?
Yeah. So earlier I've asked you about job and career prospects, but what about sex differences in occupations and where they stem from? I mean, are these really, do these really stem from just innate preferences that men and women have? Of course, they don't apply across all fields, but there are particular areas where it seems that at least when men and women have the choice and freedom to choose what they prefer, they tend to be a little bit segregated, let's say.
Exactly. So yeah, when people have the choice, they tend to fall into the kind of traditional occupations, and some of them, again, just going back to sheer physicality, some of the things that you see more men in. So like I was saying, you've got about 90% of the primary school teachers are female. And you can argue whether that there's very much to do with physicality there. But certainly if you look at male roles or male typical jobs, a lot of them are ones that require a certain amount of strength and also a certain amount of ability to work with risk. So a lot of the kind of things like construction work, these are quite dangerous, risky jobs. They require brute force. They require, a lot of things that men more naturally tend to have than women do. And it's not saying that women should be deprived of going into these jobs, but just that if you give people the choice, they tend not to go for these things. So that there are probably just fairly straightforward reasons that you don't have to be an academic to understand, but for some reason academia these days seems to be full of people who seem to find this an extremely complicated these ideas about sex differences.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, so there's good evidence also perhaps from an evolutionary perspective that the fact that men and women tend to prefer some occupations to others is at least to some extent innate, correct?
It makes sense that there would be innate. And if you look at pre-industrial societies, you'll see sex differences in occupations that to some degree mirror the kinds of things that we see today. So, for example, you'll see that like one of the areas that is almost entirely made up of men is deep sea fishing, where you're going out, you're looking for a big fish. It's a dangerous kind of area to be in, and that's been the same for forever, really. And again, these it just, I mean, it's almost a no-brainer that the people who are strongest, most kind of willing to take risks, i.e. men, are going to be more inclined to do these sorts of things. I mean, the other part of it too is that you can frame this as being male disposability, as some people like Warren Farrell would say, in that if you want a community to have a working type of birth rate, women are more important to have in that community than men are. So that's kind of fairly straightforward. So men are a bit more disposable. But I mean, it's again, that's not a negative thing. It's kind of the way that life is. I think it's difficult to see how we're going to kind of evolve beyond that without changing our bodies radically, which is a slightly dangerous idea to contemplate, I would think.
Mm-hmm. So without completely denying the possibility that in some areas and in some situations there might be some sort of sexual discrimination, I mean, it's certainly not the case that just because we look into certain fields and see them dominated by either men or women, that it's immediately a case of sexual discrimination, correct?
Not at all. You'll be, as you said, it's when you let people choose, like give them completely free choice about what kind of occupations they do, you'll find that the women will go into the more kind of people-orientated occupations like psychology. 80% of clinical psychologists are female. Teaching, nursing, much more kind of the people-orientated topics, whereas men go in for more of the thing, as it's called, orientated topics. So they're more inclined to get involved with engineering and working with objects. Carpentry is another thing. So we have, and these seem to be kind of very long-standing. That they make sense physiologically. They make sense in terms of how will people will have evolved. So women may have evolved this people orientation. because they're the ones who gestate children and who will have these newborns, and so a lot of this is about being very closely orientated towards other people, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, I think that there's positives all around for this, and it seems to be the way the world has worked for an awful long time, and I think people. I mean, I should be clear that I think that people should be allowed to gravitate to whatever sort of job that they want to and make the best of whatever they can with that. But by and large, as you say, like on average, you will find that there's this kind of sex typical type choices that people do. And I don't think we should get angry about that or say that that's wrong because it's not 50-50 kind of men and women in each thing. I think that's just the way people are, and the people are different. We should value people's differences because they might have, great advantages for people to have these sorts of differences and preferences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you agree with me, but here we're talking about sex differences, and perhaps when it comes to that kind of discussion, it's a little bit more socially and politically polarizing, but we could even think in terms of personality differences, that there are perhaps occupations where people with certain personality traits would operate better there, and people with other personality traits would be more oriented toward other types of occupations, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that people with certain traits are perhaps better and prefer to have certain occupations.
Absolutely. So women tend to score higher on the agreeableness scale of the big five, which so it makes sense that they will be maybe better at sort of dealing with people. So they'll gravitate to people-orientated jobs. Not a problem, I don't think, really at all. And as I said, I think it's been made too complicated. People, I think, overthink these things, and there's maybe various motivations for them to do so, but I think that in the end, nobody really benefits from trying to tell people that they're making the wrong choices or they've got the wrong attitudes, that they should be doing this with their life rather than that. I think that's a problem. Like I'm much more humanistic, I think, than a lot of academics are, in the sense that I as a basic fundamental idea, I think that you should encourage people to find out what they're interested in, what they're good at, and then facilitate them, to kind of help them to kind of develop on that path. And you will find that some women will go in for dangerous sports, but they will be the exception. And of course, I'm an exception too. Like being a psychologist who's a man. I mean, I'm in a minority, but I think, and it shows you. I think that the kind of thing that men who are psychologists bring is an appreciation of, there's other ways of thinking and other ways of dealing with stress, other ways of doing therapy that I think otherwise wouldn't be so obvious to somebody who has a different set of inclinations.
Mm-hmm. So to get into a more sensitive topic, criminality. Are men more prone to crime or to criminality than women?
Definitely men are more prone to the more visible types of crime. So violence against each other is something that the men are excel in, if you like. In those sorts of violent crimes, I think women's criminality is sometimes more subtle, and I think, for example, I mean, there's times where in the news, I don't want to mention any names, but a young woman who had kind of encouraged her boyfriend over a period of many months to commit suicide, and he eventually did that. I mean, that is the kind of thing that could almost be got away with, because it's not a very visible thing. It's not she didn't stab him or anything, but he died, and like her words to him were heavily implicated. So it's a kind of a more subtle form of aggression, and I think that this is under recognized, this potential for a kind of a what we call in the book slow violence, like a kind of a constant dripping of negative type communications that very much undermine or very much hurt somebody. I think that can happen a lot, and I'm not saying that women necessarily do that more than men, but I think men have an easier outlet, and that we tend to use our again physicality, our muscle power, just to kind of hit each other if it comes to that, to wanting to be violent to each other. But there are other forms of violence that women do more than men. So infanticide, I mean, that's one that women do more than men. A general sort of violence towards children, again, women do that more than men do. But I think I would hate to make this a competition about who's more violent in what particular sort of way. I think what we should be doing is trying to uncover what the roots of the violence are and deal with that. And again, we come back to things like I interviewed a forensic psychologist called Naomi Murphy, who is a very impressive career in working with male prisoners and some of the most dangerous men, sex offenders with personality disorders, the kind of people who we've been told in psychology you can't do anything for, you can't treat them, you can't treat sex offenders successfully, you can't treat people with personality disorders, sort of antisocial personality disorders successfully. But she is able to, or has been able to, with a long-term program, able to help some of these people reduce the sorts of feelings and the sorts of attitudes and behaviors that lead them into all these sorts of issues. But something that she said in this interview, which I did for the Male Psychology magazine, giving a little plug now for this new magazine that we have, she said that one of the common roots to a lot of these problems is children, and especially boys who will end up being more violent, being communicated, usually fairly overtly, that they are not wanted, to the degree that their parents basically want them dead, or they might be only have one parent. But this being communicated this sort of way seems to have a very corrosive effect on them, and again, this isn't the same as punching the child or slapping the child, although those things might happen too. But this is a verbal communication. It's a kind of subtle thing, but it can have devastating effects. So I think when more people, I think, really need to realize that, and it's a big challenge. I mean, it's probably the biggest challenge that we have in male psychology, or maybe even most of psychology, is to know how to deal with these really terrifying type people who can be very violent and do extremely unpleasant things. Like, what do we do with them? Our instinct is usually to punish them or to lock them up and throw away the key. But if you think a bit more deeply about it, and if you say, for example, if you want to look at preventing these things from happening, well, then you have to understand the roots of why that person became that very scary person in the first place. And then you realize that actually a lot of the things that they experienced, like, they would cause most people to become very dysfunctional as they grew up. And once you realize that sort of thing, then you have to start thinking about, well, maybe there's something that we can do to stop this person being such a problem for society and such a problem for themselves too. And yeah, there's a whole kind of set of other issues like that. That's, for example, looking at the attachment style that these prisoners have, and we also get into things like a lot of the time they come from families that don't have a father in them, or even a father figure, or they might have a stepfather, and they might not be very good for the child at all. There might be, violence towards them, things like that. So we have all sorts of experiences that it's almost like a recipe for creating somebody who's becomes violent. And but once you understand these things, I think it makes it. I think it makes people realize that we have, if we do have any kind of morality and sense of justice, that we really have some sort of obligation to try and get these people to recover somehow from those sorts of experiences. And it's not just for them; it helps everybody. From a selfish point of view, from the taxpayer point of view, it costs a lot of money to keep somebody locked up in a high security prison. If you're able to even reduce the types of the levels of security that they need and still keep them incarcerated, that's less costly for the taxpayer. From a selfish point of view, it's good to do those sorts of therapies. And the other thing too of prevention, I mean that's more complicated, but and not least because it means having to address the issue of family structures. And I think a lot of people have been very negative about the value of the traditional family unit, like having a male in the household principally. And saying that's can be very damaging. And of course it can be. I mean, like some fathers are terrible. They do all sorts of things, or they just abandon their children for no reason, and definitely that's a bad thing. But just like in a good case scenario, having a father in the home who's there and sort of does the kind of traditional things of providing, protecting, that sort of thing, being there and loving the family and helping everybody, those are the kind of things that create children who tend to be, they tend to want to do well in the world. They tend to want to get along with other people. But that's again a big challenge to try and get people to rethink the family unit, the family structure, and how that benefits society. It's a big challenge, really, unfortunately.
So, but these are the kinds of social factors that you think people should focus on to develop good interventions to preventing crime, or at least preventing, in this case, males from developing predisposition toward criminal behavior, correct?
Definitely, yes. I mean, I really do. I think that a lot of it comes down to probably things like having ways that will keep family units together and keep them harmonious. So some effective types of relationship counseling or therapy, I think are important, but we don't really have them. I think sometimes people complain that relationship counseling doesn't do enough to really try and keep people together. And sometimes you can't. Sometimes it's impossible to. But I think if we want to take seriously the idea of preventing a delinquency, I think this is definitely one way that we can help that. I mean, there's other things like social deprivation. And it's almost goes without saying, but I think it's worth saying, just in case somebody misunderstands what I'm trying to say here. Social deprivation too, of course. I mean, that has a massive impact. But once you've taken that sort of thing into account, it's other things. And life is complex. I mean, it's like there's no easy answers to any of this. It's always going to be a difficult thing, and it's always going to be, involve people investing a lot of time and effort into doing these things. And the terms that governments have, like 4 or 5 years in which to enact policy, and then another government is elected, and then they might reverse all of that stuff. So it's really difficult to put these things into action. But I think if more people had an appreciation of the social reasons for crime, they might think about the world a bit differently. For example, we often hear complaints about sex crimes, women getting assaulted by men. And of course, that's a terrible thing. We want to stop that. But probably one way of stopping that is to make sure that you have more, like, what tends to happen is that you get this sort of thing about, oh, men are terrible, they're kind of violent towards women, they're misogynist and things like that, and it sort of creates more stigma around men. Whereas what we need is, I think, is more appreciation of men, more appreciation that dads can be really valuable, really useful, appreciation that almost like, only a tiny minority of men will ever do these sorts of crimes. Most men will very willingly try and stop these crimes if they see them happening, but more of an appreciation of that, because I think that the kind of the negativity that we see about men, I'm guessing, and that there's not really any proper research on this, but I'm guessing has a kind of a negative impact, not just on men and on their own self-image, and of course on boys growing up even worse, but also on the way that women view men. And and if you're a woman and you think that you devalue men because the media tells you how bad that men are, well then if you're married to somebody and you're a bit dissatisfied with them for whatever reason, this human beings being human, there's all sorts of reasons for us to be dissatisfied with each other. But then she might be more inclined to go for these kind of no fault of divorces and to end the marriage. Whereas that's the thing of ending the marriage is then the road to the children becoming more likely to be dysfunctional. And of course, it's not in every case that they'll become dysfunctional, but it's just statistically more likely that that they're going to take paths that they wouldn't do if the family stayed together. So I think the whole thing of relationships being like encouraging people to have relationships that work better and being prepared to stick with things even when they are difficult, and recognizing that life is difficult and that a marriage will always have difficult patches to get through. I think getting people to recognize these things and helping them through them, I think, would help enormously. But in a way, I've given quite a long answer there, and it's kind of a lot of people will probably have gone to sleep before they got to the end of that answer, and also I'm saying that there isn't an easy answer. It's a tough answer. It's like making tough decisions about our own personal lives and looking at the long game, like looking at things in terms of generations rather than in terms of 6 weeks of CBT.
Mm-hmm. So before moving on to the next topic, I would just like to add that since you mentioned, for example, social deprivation, there's also good research done by people like Dr. Martin Daly from Canada about perceived economic inequality that usually people on the lower socioeconomic strata, men particularly, get more predisposed toward violence and violent crime because they adopt or they develop sort of a fast-paced life history strategy. And so, that's more biologically based, but it's also influenced by social factors, for example.
Absolutely true. It's endlessly complex, and I suppose people, they don't want complex answers. They just want simple, quick answers. That's the thing. I appreciate that. I'm like that too, really. But for some things, there isn't a quick answer. It's only a slow fix and a difficult one.
Yeah. So now talking a little bit about the military and military service. So do we have, or is there good enough research about the mental health effects that military service has on men?
This is an area that we wrote about in Perspective, so it was, which was a new one for me. I know that people have done some brilliant work in PTSD, combat stress type PTSD. And I've been very impressed by that. But it's not an area that I knew too much about. So I was kind of surprised because I thought that this chapter would be mainly about how to deal with all the trauma and the mental health issues that resulted from being in an army and having to engage in combat. And I was surprised to find that although there is definitely some parts of it are like that, there is mental health benefits of being in a military unit, and I think it's partly it's to do with this thing about men who tending to kind of work quite well together in groups. And I think this is underappreciated. I think often, the thing we see in social media, like a group of men, that's a threatening, sort of scary thing. But if you get a group of men who've got a common purpose, which is a positive one, and defending your country is a positive purpose, I would say, well then, people all working together, kind of becoming fit and healthy, which is also good for your mental health. Developing a bond, relying on each other, kind of learning that somebody is going to, watch out for you and kind of have your back in a tough situation. All these things really develop a kind of very positive bond and a very positive sense amongst a group of men in a unit. And so I found myself, a few years ago, I did a study of 5,000 men in America, and we found that, and I was surprised that men who were in active service had a higher positive mindset index score. In other words, had greater mental well-being than the average man in America, and I was quite surprised. So I asked a colleague of mine, Roger Kingerly, he's a clinical psychologist who specialises in military mental health, and he said, well, that's because being part of a unit has got all the benefits that I just mentioned there. Like it can be a really brilliant thing. It's a great feeling. Like men when they retire from the military can miss that sort of thing terribly. And even men who've been in combat together, where those sorts of bonds can intensify, they build lifelong attachments with their colleagues, and so he wasn't surprised by that at all. So that was my kind of first indication that there was something more to the military than again, we often get negative representations of the military, probably a lot of it since the Vietnam War, the lots of kind of lots of shame heaped upon people who would normally in other times be thought of as being heroes and really being rewarded for what they did. So yeah, really there's two sides to the whole issue of mental health in the military.
This just came to my mind, but could it be that it would have also something to do with the discipline they acquire there? Because if that would translate into higher levels of self-control, self-control is also, or tends to be correlated with good mental health outcomes and life satisfaction in general.
That makes a lot of sense. What it makes me think of is some of the research finding that for guys who are going off the rails a bit. So people who are on a path of delinquency, sometimes getting into the military is brilliant for them because it can give them a sense of discipline and self-control, and they can learn by being disciplined and self-control and taking orders from somebody instead of rebelling all the time, they can actually feel better about themselves. So, and there's other things too. It's like a lot of the things that you do in the military, like in peacetime, can be quite positive. Like people, often have the military helping out in kind of civilian emergency situations, and also there's just the fun of, you can drive around in tanks. You can get to shoot guns. All these sorts of fun things you can do. You get to use the latest technology and things. You get to fly around in a helicopter. Wow! You get to jump out of a plane. All these things that people pay lots of money to do on a kind of an adventure weekend. You get to do this all the time. So I think that there's those sorts of things help too.
Mm-hmm. So let's see if we can cover two more topics, because I think these two are very important. Starting with what in the book at a certain point you call the failure to launch. So what is this, and is it really a failure?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Is it really a failure? So the failure to launch is a kind of a fairly negative way of looking at the kind of the trajectory of boys, like who start off doing okay in education and then falling off and not really kind of getting into any sort of kind of career or anything like that. So the kind of boys who will end up sort of living at home kind of, into their 20s and 30s and not really having any kind of ambitions, maybe playing a lot of video games and things like that. So this sort of like the idea that they should properly launch themselves into life and make some sort of success of things is failed. It's a difficult thing to say. I mean, there does need to be more research into this. It's one of these areas again that people tend to. You could almost say it's again like victim blaming. It's like these guys might have various different reasons. Like so people tend to assume that they have chosen this lifestyle rather than going out and working and doing things. But it could be that if you ask these guys why, what's happening, that there might be lots of different reasons. There could be reasons to do with mental health issues. I mean, there could be ADHD or things like that might have affected their ability to get along academically or in other ways. But there's also the issue of perhaps they're just demotivated by a culture that doesn't value men very much. Doesn't value, like, why should they get married? If divorce is so easy and they just lose everything and they lose access to their children. I mean, it's underappreciated that when men lose access to their children, it can be the most traumatizing thing they experience ever, and it can be a chronic problem for them for the rest of their lives. And there is some evidence that a significant number of suicides are the result of men not being able to access their children. But a lot of younger men will see this. Maybe they've seen it in their own family. They might be they have parents that separated, and they might very much demotivate them to take on then that role that they saw fail in terms of their father's marriage, and or again, same with careers. They might feel like, well, everything that I do is denigrated. So like being in the military is often seen as a kind of a stupid thing, a negative thing, a violent thing. Like lots of things that are male typical are often denigrated as if they're not as good as doing something more cerebral or academic, or artistic even. And I think for a lot of guys, it probably is not so much a choice as being maybe backed into a corner in a way. But is it a failure? I would say it could be a failure of society to give boys a decent chance in life. As I say, I do believe that everybody, men and women, should be encouraged to find out what they're good at and try and excel at that to some degree. But I think a lot of boys just don't feel that they get that. Like competition, like a lot of the male typical things are, as I say, are denigrated. Being competitive is denigrated. Lots of things are denigrated. Mm-hmm. Even the male typical. I mean, we did a study a few years ago. Myself and Louise Liddon and Roger Kingerly actually did a study, and we found that one of the ways that men cope with stress more than women do is playing video games. And so, when you see guys sitting at home playing video games all day, you don't necessarily, like a lot of people would just think, well, they're lazy. They have, they got no interest in anything that's important. But that might be somebody who's just coping with stress, and it just goes unrecognized as that.
Yeah. So, I mean, some of the things you mentioned, I think also connect to the last question I wanted to ask you, that is, do you worry about things that are sort of, that they sort of manifest more online, but they also have real life implications, like the MGTOW movement and the incel movement, men going their own way and the involuntary celibates? I mean, in this case, there are things that manifest on the level of romantic relationships or the failure to acquire romantic relationships. So do you worry about that?
I do. I think it's, I think you get a lot of people in these movements who will, they have a certain amount of bravado about being involved. But I think, I think in an ideal world, for me at least anyway, an ideal world, like people will get together and they will try and build lives together and share things together and live happily ever after. And I mean, I could just be completely naive about life, I'm not sure. But I think that these sorts of things are a reaction, and understandable reaction to a world that's become, again, sort of pushing them into a corner, sort of marginalizing men, making men's interests be kind of second-rate interests, like things that people shouldn't really be interested in. And so if you have a world that's telling you that everything you're interested in is pointless, well, then you're going to start rejecting the world, and I think that's what we have a bit. And we have Prof. Rob Whitley at McGill University did some interesting research looking at these guys, they're the player guys. What are they called again?
Gamers.
No, not the. No, so you're gonna have to edit all this summing and ahhing out at the end. But yeah. So Prof. Whitley, he found these guys who. Sorry, my brain's just gonna.
Oh, the ones who I'm not sure if that's pick-up artists. So yeah,
that's the one. Okay, I'm just gonna take a run at this one again. So. Prof. Rob Whitley at McGill University did some very interesting research looking at pickup artists, so guys who make it almost a kind of a game to be able to seduce women, and so lots of people will say that pickup artists, I mean, these are maybe people who are not very respectable and they're doing something that's manipulative, but Rob Whitley found that actually these are guys in a lot of ways who feel a bit marginalized, feel a bit rejected by women in a lot of ways, have developed ways of overcoming that, but more than any of those things have found a kind of a sense of community within other people who are in the same position as them, and that's, I think, what a lot of guys are probably missing out on is some sort of, like, if the overall community, that society doesn't really embrace the boys and allow them to be themselves and help them to develop those things, they're going to reject society. I mean, a lot of them will. Some of them will there'll be different reactions. Like some guys will become depressed, no doubt. They'll internalize this rejection and see themselves in a deeply negative way. But some guys will react against that. They'll create their own communities, do their own thing, and just, not really want to have much to do with mainstream culture. And that's a great shame, because we're missing out on the backbone of society, really, what potentially would be the cornerstones of many good families. Instead, we have women who are wandering around wondering why they can't find a decent man anymore. Like, they can't find a guy with a good education. They can't find a guy who's interested in a relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm getting mindful of your time, Dr. Barry. So just before we go, I know that since we last spoke, you've had some interesting developments. Would you like to tell us about them?
Thanks. I'm glad to give me this opportunity. I just wanted to let people know that as part of the Centre for Male Psychology, which has been going now for a couple of years, I suppose, we have started a magazine. I had been interested in starting a journal of male psychology for a few years, well, for about a dozen years, but finally been persuaded by Louise Liddon that we should launch a magazine instead, because lots of psychologists will read this magazine because it's male psychology content. The name of the magazine is Male Psychology, but also your average person who's just interested in in men or psychology, mental health, will be able to read these things too, and everyone can enjoy it. So rather than having like 100 psychologists read an academic journal, we can have thousands of people reading this magazine. So I just wanted to flag that up, and people can sign up to our newsletter, and they can be for free on the website, Centre for Male Psychology, and they can be informed about what's coming up in the magazine. They can be informed about other events. And one other thing I just wanted to plug, if that's okay, is we're going to have the first in-person conference for the male psychology section of the British Psychological Society. So the APA have their Division 51 for men and masculinities. We have had since 2018 the male psychology section of the British Psychological Society. We've had a couple of, due to COVID restrictions, we've had 2 online conferences, but now we have our first in-person conference, and that's going to be at the University of Central Lancashire on the 20th and 21st of June 2022. And it's a psychology conference mainly aimed at professional psychologists and students, but anybody who's got an interest in things like domestic violence, things like criminality. Naomi Murphy, who I mentioned, is going to be one of the keynote speakers, and she's going to be talking about her work with prisoners. We're going to have Nicola Graham Cavan, Professor of Psychology, who's going to talk about male victims of domestic violence. And we're going to have Martin Seeger, clinical psychologist, and one of the original creator of the whole field of male psychology himself in the UK, and the original founder of the male psychology section. He's going to be talking about mainly the mental health aspects of men. And we're going to have lots of other really interesting stuff. It's a 2-day event. Everybody's welcome.
Okay, very well. So, Dr. Barry, thank you again so much for taking the time to come on the show. And I really do hope to have you on somewhere again in the future, because these are really great conversations. So.
Thanks. I really appreciate it, Ricardo. I would definitely love to come back, and just any time. Thank you very much.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, hit the subscription button, all of those things you already know. And please consider supporting the show either on PayPal or Patreon. All of the links will be in the description box of the interview, starting at $1 per month, so it would be a great help. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Pererga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vosbo, Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Antonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy and Trader in NYC. My producers Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codreanu, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.